Okay.
Sure.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello everyone and Jai Bhim everyone. My name is Archana and about me, I'm gonna introduce myself first. My name is Archana Vasantekare. I reside in Mumbai. By profession, I am an advocate, and additionally, I worked and volunteer in social issues. We have a Manali Raut with us. She's gonna introduce herself. Manali.
Hello everyone, good evening and Jai Bhim. So first of all, I would like to welcome everyone for today's session. My name is Manali Raut. I am located in Mumbai. By profession, I am a teacher. I'm into education field since more than 15 years. Now I have abroad education consultancy, and even I actively participate in various social activities. So we both of us would like to welcome everyone for today's session. This is our first session for Ambedkar Intellectual Summit 2024, as we are celebrating the life and mission of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar on his 133rd birth anniversary. This virtual summit is dedicated to nurturing dialogue, critical thinking, and innovation inspired by the profound ideals of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Our goal is to unite intellectuals, scholars, activists, and leaders from diverse backgrounds to delve them into the discussion on pivotal social, economic, and political issues. Moving forward, I just want to give a short introduction about today's session. So for today's session, we have speaker Mr. Peter with us, who is going to delve us into the Ambedkarite culture identity and the Bahujan movement, exploring challenges and opportunities in multiculturalism. So I would like to request Ms. Archana to give brief introduction about Mr. Peter to all of us.
Yes. Thank you, Manali. Now I will go ahead and introduce Peter Friedlander. So Peter is the associate professor in Hindi at Australian National University. He was previously Hindi lecturer at La Trobe University, Melbourne, 1996 to 2008, and a senior Hindi lecturer at National University of Singapore from 2008 to 2011. He learned Hindi while living in Varanasi from the year 1977 to 1982, and then studied at London University from 1983 to 1991. His PhD was on a medieval Indian poet Saint Raidas, published as The Life and the Works of the Saint Raidas. His research interests include both studies of the saint and Buddhist traditions and the relationship between the religion and politics. His recent publication includes Kabir Poems in Transformation, a foundation of the creativity in the year 2023, The Descent of the Ganga in India and Mauritius in the year 2023, then South Asian Goddess and the Natural Environment, the Religion and Ideology in Sri Lanka, the Routledge Handbook of Religious Politics and Ideology in the year 2022, then Reassessing Religion and Politics in the Life of Jagjeevan Ram in the year 2020. So we are so glad to have Peter here, and I request Peter to kindly begin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jai Bhim, to all of you, and Jai Gurudev, Bhagat Guru Ravidas Ji, and Archana and Manali. Thank you so much for your invitation to speak to you today. And I'm going to share the screen with you guys, all of us, and well, there's a PowerPoint, and I'll talk along with that. My aim is to talk for about 30 minutes or so, not much more than that, 30 minutes, maybe 40. Let's have a see. Okay, so I'd like to start by just showing you a picture of the way that people can come together to do things. And it's a picture back from about 1650 of Kabir and Raidas and Sufis and Sants all gathered together at the court of Mu'in al-Din Chisti. But before I talk more, I just also like to make sure that I can move to the next slide. Yes, I can. I'd like to acknowledge the country from which I'm speaking and the people of it. I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land which I'm speaking from. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal elders who are present amongst us from other communities. I'd also like to pay my respects to Ambedkarite and Ravidasi community members who are present virtually today online, and to their own elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to pay an acknowledgement to how I'm connected to India, which in a sense is through my granny, Ruth Fisher. So here's a photograph of my granny, Ruth Fisher, back in 1951, sitting probably in Mussoorie on the balcony of M.N. Roy's house with M.N. Roy and M.N. Roy's cat. My grandmother, my father's mother, was a revolutionary. She was from Vienna and is my family connection with India. Nothing from my English side ever went towards traveling to India. None of my English ancestors, in fact, ever went anywhere near India, it seems. But Ruth, both, first of all, first met Emin Roy in 1926 at the Communist International in Moscow. And then later on, she was able to visit India in 1951, where she met him again. And I think she also met him once more when she attended the Bandung Conference in 1955. And I sometimes think the seeds of my interests in India were sown by the way that when I was growing up in my house, there were things from India around it, like a Buddha statue, which still sits just beside me, out of shot at the moment, but she brought back from India in 1951. And I think that also my grandmother had a sense that India was a vision of how an alternative liberal model for society and culture could exist throughout the world. And if you search on the internet, you will find that she also still believed there was a possibility of revolution in India up until the middle of the 50s and wrote about it. Not sure how realistic her idea was, but that was her vision, and somehow it helped to shape my visions. But what I'd like to do in the first 10 minutes or so of talking to you is talk to you a little bit about how I encountered India. And what I'd particularly like to do is draw your attention to, this is a picture of myself in about 1980. I certainly look a little bit different than I do today, looking at my image here on the screen as well. And these are a couple of paintings I made from around 1982 or so of the alleyways in Benares and the riverfront in Benares. And so like many people coming from outside of India, I was fascinated by India's culture and society. But I was also quite shocked in a way by many things I saw when I arrived in India, first of all, in 1977. And one of the first things that happened led me to spend some time in the Burmese monastery in the south of Delhi in Maroli. And here's a picture of how I think I saw myself. I drew a picture of myself around that time. And also a couple of drawings of the Burmese monastery. I think it's the one in the middle that was the Burmese monastery. But I actually turned up there for not possibly the best of reasons, you could say, because in those days we used to carry money as travelers' checks. And I was swindled out of all of my travelers' checks on the second day of arriving in Delhi while trying to book some railway tickets to go to Mumbai. And so I ended up with very little money. And so I went to stay in a Burmese monastery in Maroli, which at that time was quite a rural area to the south of Delhi, a little bit different from how it is now, after all. And it was really inspiring to me to have my first contacts with Buddhist monks. And amongst the monks there, as well as the Burmese and international monks, there were also Indian monks. And looking back on it now, I believe these were my first contact with Ambedkarite monks, because I think some of them did talk to me about how they were from Maharashtra. But it's quite difficult when you're first encountering a different culture to realize what was going on. And if they ever told me they were Ambedkarites, that's not what stuck in my memory. What stuck in my memory was that they told me that they were Buddhists, and that all the Buddhists in India were working together to try and support each other for the welfare of all living beings. And this might have also led to me having the seeds sown for myself becoming a Buddhist, which I did in about the mid-1980s. Another significant meeting which I'd like to mention here was some years later. This was probably about 1979 or 80. I had an opportunity to visit Mandu in Madhya Pradesh, and there I had my first conversations with Adivasi community members from India. And I was by this time able to speak a little bit of Hindi as well. And this is the central market in Mandu as it was when I first visited it, a sort of bare earth traditional environment in which the public were all able to share in the space, and markets were held while I was there. And on the right-hand side, you can see how it is now. It's a car park. But what really impressed me in Mandu when I talked with the Adivasi community members was the way in which, because I could speak a bit of Hindi, they said to me that they were able to get an impression of the world which was different from that which they could get from everyday media. And also through talking with them directly, through that meeting, I was able to get an impression of the kind of struggles that the Adivasi community in Mandu was engaged in, and how they were trying to maintain the traditions, but also to deal with the new situation which they were finding themselves in as mass tourism was developing in the area. But perhaps for the purposes of today's talk, the most significant of all of these initial encounters with different sorts of communities that I had was when I went to Khajuraho. And in Khajuraho, in around 1980, I ended up fascinated by the place. As you can see, I was always drawing pictures wherever I went and talking with people. But what I can't show you at the moment is that I looked a bit different than I do now. And one of the things that was different about me was initially I had quite long hair and I carried a guitar. And I became very fascinated by talking with the Dom community members of the village, because they were the musicians who played in the marriage band. And I became very friendly with them. And the friendship developed to the point where I was able to go with members of the Dom community on a trip into the Dehats, into the Musafil, right back into a day's journey away from Khajuraho in the middle of nowhere, a long bus ride, and then a long walk for hours through the fields. And we ended up in a village which wasn't even as developed as the village which you can see on the left-hand side of the picture, which was Khajuraho visited at the time, but was a village entirely of mud buildings, traditional architecture and straw, and well, some capril roofs as well. And we were there with the function in mind of attending the wedding, or in fact the manoti, the mangani ceremony for a marriage between a boy from Khajuraho village, from the Dom community, and a girl from the Dom community from that village. And I think because of the way that I arrived with the Dom community, and I might have been the first Westerner to arrive in that village for a very long time, and I was carrying a guitar, they presumed that I was a foreign Dom. And so they treated me like the rest of the Dom, the villagers. And I have a very vivid memory of attempting to buy beedi. And so when I wanted to buy beedi, my friends, the Dom, said, well, you won't just be able to go into the house that functions as a shop. look, what you're going to have to do is this. And they helped me. And so I went up to the threshold of the shop and I put down my money on the threshold of the shop, on the doorway, on the tehira. And then so I had to step back 3 paces. And then the shopkeeper stepped forward from inside the shop, picked up my money and put down the bidi. And then he stepped back and sort of waved at me or something. And I was able to then step forward and get my bidi. That sort of thing was quite striking because whereas people had told me, oh, distinctions on the basis of caste are a thing of the past in modern India, there I was living through an experience of how if you were in the company of other people who were of Dom community, then you would be treated as a Dom if you were in the right contexts. And equally shocking was that when I went back to the village of Khajuraho, as soon as I got there, some of the shopkeepers, the lalajis in the village, came up to me and said, "You were for 3 days with the Dom?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "So you must have eaten their food?" And I said, "Yes, it was a wedding. I ate the roti, the achar, and I drank the desi chai, which was just hot water with gur in it." But they said, "No, you ate their food. That's the point. अब तुम इस गांव में नहीं रह सकते हो. हमको मालूम नहीं था कि विदेश में भी Dom है." So they told me that they didn't realize that there were Dom abroad. And they said I couldn't stay there. So perhaps they imagined I would go and stay outside the village with the other Antajias. But in fact, my host, who was a slightly liberal man, a Rajput who viewed himself as the headman of the village, told me I could continue to stay with him in his house, but that his wife wouldn't allow me any longer to ever touch any of the cooking pots or utensils in the house. And I was sent out to go to the market to buy things like this very lota, which I was told I would have to use in future because I wouldn't be able to use the tali, katore, or lota of the house because, well, as you know, they wouldn't be able to use it themselves afterwards. So it's quite a confronting experience. And it's always struck me since then that allowed me to see a different way of seeing India than perhaps many Westerners do when they arrive in India. And it's also, interestingly enough, another significant moment when people identified themselves to me. First, I'd met Buddhists, then I'd met people who said, "Hum Adivasi hai." And in this case, I'd met people who said, "Hum Dom hai, isliye hum gaon ke bahar rehte hain." But they said also, but we're still represented on the temples in Khajuraho, along with all the other communities, but in separate freezers. And then some years later, I'd gone back to university in London. And then in between my degree and my PhD, I went and spent 3 months in Kabir Chora Mutt. And here you can see a couple of guys from Kabir Chora Mutt, the gatekeeper and one of his friends, sadhus, bhagats, as they were called. And you can see the way that the courtyard of that monastery looked at that point. And you can see a book that I eventually only published last year, which looked at the way that the tradition of the Kabir Pant had preserved their songs. And it was amazing to discover how traditional knowledge was transmitted within the Kabir Pant. And every morning I was able to listen to the bhagats. And in fact, everybody gathered together to chant the verses from the Bijak, which at that time they had this small edition that they'd produced, a kind of a Gutka version of it, which was edited by Shukdev Singh, who I then met as well and got to know through that process. But it's interesting that, of course, it's a famous Kabir verse which says, "Sadhu ke jat mat pucho," or something like that. Don't ask the caste of Sad. Sad ki jat mat pucho. But the interesting thing is nobody sort of identified themselves by caste titles because they weren't, once they were renunciates. But even so, some people told me about life as Adivasis. Some people told me about life as Dalits. And I always remember one day talking with one of them, Bhagats, and I said to him, so all these poems by Kabir are very critical of Brahmins. And he looked at me and said something to the effect of, oh, no, you misunderstand. He's only critical of Brahmins who behave incorrectly. And I remember thinking, so you are probably a Brahmin sadhu. And this seemed to be a feature of Kabir Chora, was that everybody was still in some way or another aware of each other's status, but everybody had renounced it. Quite a remarkable thing to also encounter. Another way in which a possible revolution against caste and prejudice and discrimination took place in India, and had been doing so for the last 500 years. A little bit later than this, I also got a chance from about 1987 onwards to interact with the Ravidasi community at Rajghat. And here's some pictures of one of the different events which was taking place at the Rajghat temple of Ravidas in Benares, the patron of whom was Jagjivan Rambabu, although he'd already passed away by the time I was involved in this. And there I met the man who's in the middle of the picture on the left, who was called Ram Lakhan, but chose to use no other name, and who was a former irrigation minister of UP. And he was basically the organizer of the temple project. And is a marvelous person to meet somebody who had such limitless energy to try and develop the project which Babu Jagjivan Ram had started and Meera Kumar was still patron of. And I also had the good fortune of meeting the man who's standing beside the man who's speaking in the microphone, whose name was Shukdev Singh, who was working on the Bani of Bhagat Guru Ravidas Ji, although we knew him as Redas Ji in Benares. And eventually that was published as Redas Bani and also inscribed on the walls of that temple. And Shukdev, although he was not from the community any more than I am, also deeply identified with the kind of struggles of the people involved here. And I think he was able to impart to me a great knowledge of the meaning of the Bani of Bhagat Guru Ravidas Ji. And it was very interesting to be able to be part of another process by which knowledge about the life and works of Redas and how to study it was transmitted to me, both by these two and also by my colleague Winant Kaluat, who was researching manuscripts and was from Belgium. So all these kind of groups of people that I've met helped me to understand that although I met some fascinating people from Savaran communities, and some of them I really valued their friendship as well. They were the kind of outsiders of those communities. There was also a way in which I could identify in the life and struggles of people such as the Ravidasi community, the Kabir Panthi, the Dom, the Adivasi, and the Buddhist community, a similarity with some of the things which I felt echoed with my own family's background as revolutionary ex-Jewish community members from Central Europe. But what I'd like to go on to talk about now is the term Bahujan, because one of the difficult things here is to really understand, is it a particular community that I was meeting, or was it many communities? And actually, I'd think another thing about Bahujan is that I've came across it once I became a Buddhist as well, because there is a sutta, after all, called Bahujan Hitaya Sutta, Itivutika 84. And in that sutta, when you look at the translation, the word Bahu means, after all, many, as it does in modern Hindi, and Jan means person. And then if you try and translate it from the Pali, people say that the best thing is to simply understand it as the people. And the teaching of that sutta and elsewhere in the Buddhist canon is, after all, that there are three kinds of people who arrive in the world for the welfare and happiness of the people. And they are the Buddha, arahants, and also disciples who are sincerely and completely following the path. So within Buddhism, there is a clear understanding of what the term Bahujan refers to. Interestingly enough, though, another way in which we can understand Bahujan is, I can describe it perhaps as being from a Savaran perspective, because after all, the motto of Akashvani is Bahujan Hitaya, Bahujan Sukhaya. And AIR nowadays translates that as meaning for the benefit of the masses, for the happiness of the masses. I don't know how you feel about that, but whenever I hear the word masses, it makes me think of masses and the elite, as if there's some implication that the masses are different from the elite. And I must admit also that it's a little bit like my sense sometimes was in the West, that as somebody from a mixed background culturally in England, there were people who saw me as other, perhaps part of the masses and not part of the elite of society who determined where people should be in society. And so this term Bahujan, it may give a sense of the people, it may give a sense of the great numbers of the people, perhaps the masses is a good translation of it. And in something like Apte's Dictionary of Sanskrit, it's translated as a great multitude of people. But I've been puzzled while I've been doing the research for this paper to realize that although it says various places, well, many places on the internet, it's repeated that this is also said in the Veda. But I looked through as many indexes of Vedic texts as I can, and I can't see any references to the term Bahujan anywhere in Hindu Vedic texts. The closest thing I can find is a reference from Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is quoted in the document which I referenced at the bottom of this slide. Praja sukhe sukham rajya, prajanam cha hitayam. Something like, in the happiness of his public rests the king's happiness, in their welfare his welfare. But this isn't really the same as the Buddhist idea of Bahujan Sukhaya or Bahujan Hitaya. It's a different idea, isn't it, about the king will only be benefited, the ruler is only be benefited if he rules according to Dhamma, which is another Buddhist idea. But it's not the idea that we find in the Buddhist suttas in reference to this particular phrase. And so what seems to be happening is that people from perhaps the 19th century onwards have been appropriating this Buddhist teaching and saying that the implication of what Kautilya and others said is the same. But it's very interesting that this is repeated endlessly, but with no actual source ever found for it. I have troubles as an academic with finding the sources of things. I think you might do as well at times. So another issue is that people often say to me that Jyotirabha Phule was the first person perhaps to introduce the idea of the Bahujan. Now my Marathi is not as good as my Hindi, or मेरी Hindi काफी अच्छी है इस काम के लिए, लेकिन it was not entirely perfect for everything that I want to be able to do. But from my reading of the Hindi versions of Ghulam Giri, which I think is first published in 1873, he talks about the Dalits, he talks about Ati Shudras, but I can't find him actually saying Bahujan anywhere either. So I'm not sure when the Maharashtrian movement that he started really started to use the term Bahujan. I'd be very, very happy if people could show me what the earliest uses of the term Bahujan are from that time, the 19th century. What I do know, though, is that I've also done many studies now, not just of the Bani of Ravidas, but also of Ravidasiya histories of their own community. And probably the first one of these is this book here, which looks like that in my hands. It's only a photocopy of the original. The Ravidas Ramayan, which was written by Bakshidas Jatav from Agra. or for Meerut rather, and he speaks of the Jatav or Yadav community as Mula Hindu, and mentions the name in the conclusion to his work. He mentions many individual communities, but the only inclusive term that he uses really is Jatav. So again, I don't find the term Bahujan in use at that point. Now, what I do find, though, is that my readings of Acharya Medarti and the early Buddhist reformers in places like Lucknow, Kanpur in particular, in the early part of the 20th century, were times in which the Buddhist teachings were being revived. And I think it may be there that Bahujan started to be used as a reference term for all of the communities that were being referred to at this point. And one of the clear pointers to that as well was in this wonderful book, which I found when I was back in India, back in the 1980s, which is, as you can see, called Ravidas Ambedkar Charitmanas. You must understand that neither this previous one, the so-called Ramayan, nor the Charitmanas, so anything to do with Ram. They are stories of the different people, Buddha, Ravidas, Ambedkar, written in the manner of religious work. And Bhaskar mostly refers to the people he is addressing as Dalit. However, it's important to bear in mind that he also is one of the first people I read who wrote, in a sense, a history of the Bahujan community, because he concludes his work with an account of Kanchi Ram and his founding of the Bahujan Samaj Party, also written in medieval Hindi verse, kind of. And there you can see this nice picture that illustrates how Bhaskar saw this. So I think one of the issues with these different Bahujan accounts of who is in the Bahujan is they are normally, it ends up as being like a list of jatis. It doesn't have one characteristic. So for instance, going back to Ravidas Ramayan, 1911, Aratat, Priya Shaka Kepatak, Pratishaka Kepatak Parusha Artat, Aharva, Satrava, Jeshava, Gole, Gusi, Dhusia, Doha, Chamkatia, Chahor, Kuril, Koram Charsh, Nigota, Patragota, Aditva. It keeps going, and then it comes down to Burbia and Jatav, Jatia, Ramdasi. Keeps on going like that. So people's efforts at this point were to imagine the community by listing all the jatis that belong to it. How does that relate to modern definitions of Bahujan, which also include, in many cases, OBC, scheduled tribes, i.e. Adivasi communities, and other religious minorities? I don't know. Was it Kanchi Ram's vision which got this idea of the Bahujan sort of to fruition? But did it really flourish? I don't know. I'm going to keep going now and get to my last part of my talk to avoid overrunning too badly. And I'd like to talk to you about, well, I was asked to talk about challenges and opportunities for Ambedkarite identity. And so because of that, I'm going to use that phrase, Shikshit Bano, Sangatit Raho, Sangarsh Karo, to think of three challenges and opportunities related to those three themes: education, organization, and struggle. And I think the challenge facing Ambedkarite communities, and maybe all communities at this time, is to deepen education at a time of increasing intolerance in the world. After all, if I just diverge for one instant, while I was working with Kabir Pantis, I remember once going up to Jaunpur and meeting with members of the madrasa at the main mosque in Jaunpur and explaining to them that I was somebody from interest studying Kabir, and that I was a person from Jewish background. And I remember them saying, "Ye to bahut achhi baat hai, aap bhi asmani kitab ke log hain." So how different is that? At that time, Jewish and Muslims, we were all fellow followers of the heavenly books, the Asmani Kitab. I don't think I'd be able to go into a madrasa in Jaunpur at this time and find such a welcome. So there's a lot of problems with increasing intolerance within communities and communities against each other. But the opportunity that this very event that you're taking part in represents is to reach across national boundaries, to connect with like-minded people around the world, within India and within the diaspora. And I think that's also a very important opportunity nowadays, because the challenges facing members of the Ambedkarite diaspora are very different in a sense from that within South Asia or within India. And last week, just a week ago now, I was speaking with a group of the Ambedkar International Mission here in Melbourne, celebrating the Jayanti. And I was talking, and I suggested to them, and I don't think people contradicted me, that one of the critical issues that people of color face in the West is that they're all discriminated against, whether they are from Ambedkarite background or Savaran background or Adivasi background. So to some extent, the issue of discrimination changes. All people of color face discrimination against them. But then this is something very important that's happening in the West and has been happening, I know, for the last 50 or more years. Prejudice against people from Ambedkarite, Dalit, and other communities continues even once communities leave India and become part of the diaspora. And here's a picture, by the way. It was a drawing from when I was teaching English back in Benares in the late 1970s and learning Hindi. And it was fascinating to talk with all the people who were the students, adults, who were trying to improve their spoken English. And they wanted to deepen their education. But I also saw that they were feeling that by being taught by a foreign English speaker of English, they would deepen their language understanding. And they did. But I also remember two things very prominently, which are relevant to this. I remember trying to teach them about how to say I'll versus I will or I shall, and somebody raising their hand and saying, "Sir, sir, sir, you can teach us that, but it will be wrong. We're not allowed to in India." So even though they wanted to gain authority by being taught by a foreign person, they knew that their own Indian standards were different from international standards. And the other thing, which is perhaps particularly relevant today, is I remember we were talking one day in one class, and somebody was saying he really liked asking, he really enjoyed his hobby, which was gardening in English. And I said, "No, iska matlab hai ki aap mali hai?" He said, "No, no, no. No, मैं हलवाई हूँ." So anything to do with caste identities would set off bells and whistles in people's minds, press buttons, in other words. And this was something that continued to strike me throughout my time in India and to this day, that these categories live with us in ways which education doesn't cause us to completely transcend, but just reinterpret. Let me talk about the next thing, which is challenges and opportunities in regards to organization. And I think the challenge is to avoid being divided by our differences. And the opportunity is to learn more about each other so that all can work on what connects, not what divides. Here's a picture of the followers of Bhagat Guru Ravidas at the temple in Benares in about 1986. But it makes me remember something that one of the speakers in Melbourne talked about, Mr. Atul. He was coming, he was a great enthusiast for Nasik and the temples of Maharashtra, but he also talked to us about the 9 virtues, I believe it was, of the Lichavi community, which helped them have a strong community. And one of the things he said was it was important, according to the Buddhist followers, the Buddhist people at that time, such as the Lichavis, I think it is. Please correct me if I'm wrong. We'll find out where it was, because we can listen back to what Mr. Atul said when he talked to us. He said one of the things was that we need to come together for significant occasions, like the Ambedkar Jayanti. We need to pay respect to our elders, as we do here in Australia, hopefully, and you do there as well. We need to pay respect to women. We need to allow everybody to participate, as you can see in this Ravidasya gathering. And everybody includes people like myself and Shukdeo and others who are actually from different communities altogether. And we also need to be concerned about education. And we also need to be concerned about the future of the whole community. So these kind of things are very important. And just as a hint of something I'm also looking at the moment, I think it's very possible, for instance, if we look back at the 22 vows that Ambedkar proposed, to look at them again and think about what do they tell us about what connects Sants and Buddhists and Ambedkar's teachings. Because there's a lot in there which is worth looking at. And it needs perhaps some re-examination over time as well. And then lastly, I'm not unsure if I like the word agitation. I think I find Sangharsh Karna, as we all do, a struggle. So struggle, it's like the Buddha talks about. You can't be too little in your activities. You shouldn't be too weak. You shouldn't be too extreme. You need to find a middle way. So how the challenge here, in my mind, is how can people from Ambedkarite and other communities agitate for the recognition of their rights? And I put this image of a sort of kaleidoscope of images of Benares from when I was living there and trying to work with the Ravidasi community there, to show that I was actually listening to many, many voices from many, many communities. And they all contributed to a kind of a kaleidoscopic vision of the stories of the communities and their histories. And if any community doesn't speak up, it seems to me that their story can be written out of history, because there are many people who try to limit the story. And people then will forget the story. And although I can't really show it to you very clearly, because I don't think you can actually see my mouse, but in the middle of this picture, there's a picture of a buffalo grazing on just outside the mosque, which is highly contested in Benares at the moment, which was then a fairly quiet and uncontested open space, not far from Golden Temple. And so we need to remember the stories of people who were living there at the time and peaceably living amidst these different religious sites, which is so different from the story you might be hearing today. So the ways in which people can participate in telling the truth about experiences of discrimination and the lived experience that you have might be a way in which people can struggle, sangharshkaro, in order to make sure that your voices are heard. And I think I have one last slide to show you, and a bit of an echo of the first slide too, because I've got a bigger picture here of the painting which was probably made at the court of Dara Shikoh, showing the meeting at Mahuddin Chishti's, I think it's Mahuddin Chishti's Dargah site in Ajmer. And as you can see, it's got the Sants and the Sufis down at the bottom, and then the courtiers all meeting together. Charles Perkins was a prominent Australian First Nation Indigenous rights activist, and he said back in the 1960s, we cannot live in the past, but the past lives in us. In other words, you can't just sort of say, oh, the past is gone, we can now move on, because the past lives in you. In many cases, through intergenerational trauma, because we experience the traumas that our parents lived. I feel that my father was very sort of fragile in his emotional life because he had lost all of his extended family in the Holocaust. So not surprisingly, he was somebody who had witnessed the entire destruction of his people almost, and he came out of it severely traumatized. And I think that then gets passed on to the next generation. So the challenge is to be true to the past, to be able to speak to the past, but also come together to live in the present. And yes, there you go. So Bhagat Guru Ravidas ji, he said that we should all find Begumpura. Begumpur Seher Ka Naam. Let's find the city named the sorrowless city, Begumpura. A place where there is no suffering, Duk Andho Nahi Tihi Tham. Where there is forever security for all. Waha Keri Sada, Mere Bhai, my brothers. And this is critical, of course, isn't it? Dom Nasem Ekso Ahi. Where none is second or third, all are one. And Jo Hum Saheri, Sumit Hamara. And whoever is my fellow citizen is my friend. So there's a lot in Guru Ravidas's teaching summed up in there. But let's also think about the way that the Buddha said in the Metta Sutta, the three major aspirations should be, may all beings be happy, may be free from suffering. May all beings be secure, sabe hontu cha camino, and may all beings see good fortune. So I'd like to conclude by saying, sabe satta sukhi hontu, sabe hontu cha camino, sabe badrani pasantu. Jai Bhim, thank you very much. I'll now stop the sharing and hand back. Now, I'm imagining, oh, good. Thank you.
It was really a great session. Thank you so much, Mr. Peter, for providing us with wonderful information. And he has witnessed a discrimination in various community of people. Also, he has explained us the way Buddhists working and supporting to each other. He has also explained us the about the term Bahujan, that Bahu means many and Jan means person. So Bahujan is the term used when many people come together. Also, he has explained us about challenges and opportunities organization has in making connection and meetings. So the challenges they have is to avoid being divided by our differences, and opportunities are to learn more about each other. So all can work on what connects, not what divides. And to achieve this, we must come together the way we come together to celebrate Ambedkar Jayanti. So thank you so much once again, Mr. Peter. And moving forward, we'll continue with Q&A session. So if from audience, anyone wants to ask any question, so audience can raise their hand so that Mangesh sir can unmute them, or they can put their question in the chat session.
And I can also say that what I would like to say that people can put questions into the meeting chat. I believe that's what you're intending.
Yes,
And
yes.
I can already see there's one there. Right, and there's a very interesting comment there about people don't want to be involved in primary activities like farming, etc. This week, I'd just like to make a comment. I was talking with one of the Ambedkar International Mission activists here in Melbourne, and he was saying he'd just come back from a Volunteer Australia Day, where he and other members of the group that he was working with and others from many communities from his office were all taking part in a day when they go out and clear up litter and try to clean up Australia. And he was saying it's very wonderful that in Australia we can all do this and not feel that we're being connected with past occupational statuses of our communities. So in answer to your gentleman there, the questioner from Tripura, I think it's very important that we are able to distinguish between how sometimes in India at the moment, if somebody does something which seems to be related to a traditional activity, they may be stigmatized for it. But if they live in the diaspora, they may be able to do some of these kind of activities from a different perspective. I do not have an idea about how this can be improved in India, Pranay. But I think it is a real challenge that we do face, which is, yeah, how can you, if you are a gardener, a Mali, then how can you then enjoy gardening with knowing that it was a traditional form of oppression of your community to be a member of a Mali community? So how do we make those connections between what you're actually doing and what I don't want to talk too much. Just say one thing. One thing, Pranay, is how we identify for ourselves. So we can do something such as enjoying gardening. But then what's different is that when people look at us gardening, then in their eyes, they may say, oh, what do Mali hai? And so that is the problem, that the external impression of what identity is radically different from our own internal pictures. I never thought of myself, for instance, Pranav, as being a Jew, but people would beat me up at school saying, oh, you're Jewish, you need to be beaten up. I never was. So internal view is one thing, external view is another. Thank you so much for a very good question.
One can unmute themselves and they can ask the question if they want to ask directly to Peter sir.
And I think I saw Arif appeared at one moment. Yes, Arif, please. If you unmute yourself, we'll be able to hear your question.
Thanks a lot, sir. I have just joined, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes. Welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, sir. Actually, I have just joined, sir. So I'm getting the ideas. And in fact, Ambedkar has always been a great iconic figure for me. I kept on learning. I'm right now sitting in my library, and with the permission of the host, I have just shared the link with other groups also, wherein mostly students, especially interested in the studies on Ambedkar studies, especially interested in what they just. I'm highly thankful that I'm getting these very innovative ideas from you, sir. So I will keep on adding on the session because I have just joined. So
Thank you
a lot,
so much,
sir.
Arif. Thank you so much. And it's so important, isn't it, that in a sense, whatever community or identity we are identified with by others, we can also share in exploring the groups of identities that we all have, which are so varied. No one person is the same as anybody else. Everybody's different. There was Arif, can I respond to your question, your kind of thing by giving you a thought? There's a very wonderful book by Sudhir Kakar called The Indians, and he starts by saying when people talk about what identity is, if I'm in America and somebody asks where I'm from, I say India. If I'm in India and somebody asks me where I'm from, I say Punjab. If I'm in Punjab and somebody asks me where I'm from, I say Ludhiana. And if I'm in Ludhiana and somebody asks me where I'm from, I say over there. So identity is always relative to the person who's asking you the question. And that's a challenge for us because we are now all living all around the world and all around India. Thank you so much.
And sir, we have multiple identities, as you said.
Of course.
And acknowledging and as well as respecting that multiple identities is the message of all the Democrats, especially of Ambedkar.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, Arif.
It is an honor. It is an honor to listen to you, sir. Thank you, sir.
And I can see a question from Prakriti or a comment. The snippet from my field experience with the Dom community. How a foreigner also acquires a caste Indian. Yes, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because normally what happens nowadays is that, is it the case that as long as we look like a Westerner, we will be presumed to be some kind of honorary high status Savaran person? It's only when we look like somebody quite different that we might be taken as having a different identity. But it's truth. I'm a Mlech, according to traditional Indian views. I always was and always will be. So it is always dependent on views. I do think as well, I would be fascinated to hear as time goes on in your discussion of Ambedkarite identity, this issue that many foreigners mistakenly see a whole group of Indians, and now that people no longer wear traditional dress, they think all the men are all the same because they're all wearing business suits. But how quick it is in every workplace around the world that a group of Indians will get together and work out where all the members of the office group actually fit into traditional hierarchies. It doesn't take long, does it? I'm sure everybody will agree when you go into a new workplace. The idea that everybody has now become one modern identity is going to be very hard to actually agree with if you're from a Dalit community.
Yeah, I think Nivesh wants to ask question. Nivesh.
Please.
Mandeep sir, can you unmute him?
They can themselves unmute and ask the questions, but I will.
Yeah.
Kalyani have also raised her hand.
Yeah. Nivesh is there now, unmute.
Hi, Peter. Myself, Kalyani here. So I have a question. When you were studying Hinduism as a religion in India, and when you come across Buddhism, what difference you made after your studies?
So when I came across both Hinduism and Buddhism, because I'm a kind of person who likes to also try to do some practice as well as simply book study, one of the main things I found was that I had an experience where once I was trying to sit with some sadhus, and they were telling me that the most important thing in the practice was to chant a particular mantra. But I was thinking, but that is very, and I had to chant it correctly in Sanskrit or something like this. And I was thinking, but this is very culturally specific. If I don't know Sanskrit and if I can't chant, then how is it possible that this is a universal way to liberation? But when I met
That's right.
Buddhists who were practicing vipassana, and the only qualification for vipassana is that we should be able to breathe as a living being, I was profoundly impressed by the egalitarian nature of Buddhist tradition. And I think Ambedkarji's views also echo that and restate that and reinforce that, which is that there is some aspect of Buddhism which is profoundly egalitarian. Whereas it seems that within the Hindu tradition, there are both subaltern, everyday, working class, different Hindu traditions, which are very vibrant and full of life. But there are also traditions which are focused on hierarchy above all other things. And that is very difficult for somebody like me to accept, because I've never felt a member of the groups of people who set the hierarchies. I always felt from childhood onwards somebody who was an outsider. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's because Baba Sahib has got option to select which religion, like Sikhism or Hinduism, but he chose Buddhism. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, sir. May I ask?
Please.
I'm a retired doctor from India. You mentioned two books. One is Ravidas Ramayan, published in 1911, and Shri Ravidas Ambedkar Charitamanas. Whether the organizers can provide PDF file of these books to read?
I don't know the answer to that exactly, but I do know that Ravidas Ramayan is quite widely available in markets in India. So it is still in publication, and it comes as well with, now there's a modern Hindi commentary as well. So I think there's no difficulty in sourcing a copy of that. I am not at all sure about whether Ravidas Ambedkar Charitmanas is easily available, but it still would be something where we would need, I think, to contact the copyright holders and the other activists who published it to find out more about R.P. Shastri, Sant Bhaskar, and what his successors would feel about distributing his book. I'm not in the position to distribute books, in other words. Thank you so much. But definitely Ravidas Ramayan you can find in the market and on bazaars. There are then many different Ramayans, and they're all fascinating in their own way as well. Ramayans of Ravidas, I'm saying, not just Ramayans. Obviously, there are many of those. But many Ravidas Ramayans exist. But this is a special one, the first one. And if anybody can find an earlier one, that would be fantastic as well. One more question, I think. Is there time for one more question? We might be running out of time. Swapnil, I can see you've unmuted yourself. Please, and you come onto that line. Let's have a question from you.
I don't have any questions.
Oh.
Yeah. So
Jessica or Nivesh, you can ask your question.
Excuse me.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Can you hear me, sir?
Ah, Vishaka. Yes, I think I can see something. Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the insightful session. Sir, I have only one question that I want to ask. Sir, what is the major finding you believe in the caste and race?
The relationship between caste and race.
Yes,
I
sir.
think it is a question a bit like, how do you determine jati? Jati will always be determined by what you might call eventually शादी की जो संबंध जो होते हैं, तो जिन बंधलों में आप शादी कर सकते हैं. So it seems to me that jati is not necessarily in some senses a racial issue, because it can be of a particular group, whereas race can be a larger group. They can be, after all, Tamils from many different communities, but they won't all marry each other. So it seems to me that anthropologically, there's a difference between jati, a marriage grouping, and race, which is a larger kind of organization where whole groups of people decide that they will identify by common characteristics. I think also it's obviously an issue which different people describe in different ways. And the other thing which has been quite important for me to understand in the years that I've been doing studies of this has been that the existence now of DNA studies shows that in many ways everybody in India has a baseline, a kind of quantity of DNA within them, which is common to all people in South Asia. There is no such a person, apparently, according to these studies, who is purely of one community or another. Everybody has this ancestral South Asian community in them. And equally, the other point which might be important to bear in mind is the DNA studies indicate that everybody in India and everybody in the world shares a basic characteristic. And here in Australia, the indigenous people of Australia and the indigenous people of India find that they have common DNA markers as well. So we need to think in a very broad sense about these categories. And so I think your question is a very good one. How should we think about jati versus... Interesting question. क्योंकि मैं हिंदी में भी सोचता हूँ कि just जाति है, race क्या है, इसके बारे में अपनी भाषा में सोचिए कि in भाषा में इसका मतलब क्या है. I believe we're coming to the end of our time. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Any last
Hello.
question we can take? Any urgent question? Any
Hello.
last question? Yes.
Hello.
Yes. Nivesh.
Hello. Hello. Good evening, sir. Sir, I have only one question regarding in today's intolerance culture. How can it help of the caste society that is unite in the oneness we talk about, but we can't achieve till now?
I think my feeling is that what is realistic, and that's not necessarily ideal, is that the more that we can tell everybody our story about what our life is and how it's lived and our experiences of our family and community makes a contribution to this conversation about how we fight intolerance. That is the important thing. I don't think there's any one magic remedy which will solve this problem. After all, if there was, Ambedkar, Guru Ravidas, the Buddha would have told us what that remedy was. It's a constant struggle to find the way to tell our stories so that people know our stories and can see the world as full of all these stories, and therefore realize that intolerance is not a way that they will be able to actually fully realize the nature of the lived experience of everybody in the world. Thank you. That's a really good question, though. I agree. That's the basic question. So you got the right question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I
then.
think we might
Thank
have
you.
reached
Thank you
the
for this
time
insightful
limit.
session.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Hello.
Thank you. And by the way, my email is available on the ANU website. You'll find it available there. I was introduced as talking from the Australian National University. And please do, if you have more questions and would like to communicate with me, that is the best way to communicate with me. Thank you. Jebim.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Yeah, please continue.
Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you,
Jai Bhim,
Peter.
Jai
This is so insightful session, and I would really like to thank Mangesh sir, Swapnil, and the background team. They made this session very easy, and it goes really well. Next, I will go ahead and make an end note of this session. There are more sessions till 14th of
Hello. Hello.
thoughts of the speaker. So thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Mangesh sir, everybody.
Yeah.
Kevin.
Also, we
Jebim.
would like to invite you all for the next session, which is there at 8 p.m. Whose speaker is Ms. Varsha Iyer, and her topic is Unraveling Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar as a Sociologist. So do join the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jai Bhim.